One of the advantages we have with basing the production here in New Zealand is because we have Weta Digital and our post-production facility, and everything is like within a mile or two of each other, including the studio that we're shooting the film. And to have to shoot the film in New Zealand, but then to go to the States or Europe or wherever to do all of the effects, you know, and to try and do things long distance would have made what is a very complicated production even more complicated.
To bring Lord of the Rings to life on screen obviously depended very heavily on visual effects. And Peter had built up a facility called Weta Digital.
The genesis of Weta Digital was Heavenly Creatures. Peter Jackson was working on that film. It would be 1993, 1994. One of Peter's associates at the time, a gentleman named George Port, did some investigation into the cost of digital visual effects and went to Peter and in a very Kiwi fashion said, well, we don't really have to pay for these visual effects elsewhere. We'll just do this stuff ourselves. We'll buy a couple of pieces of equipment and do the effects ourselves. And so they went out and bought an SGI workstation and a couple of pieces of software. They bought a film scanner, a film recorder, and bang, your visual effects facility. Thus, Weta Digital was born.
So the team started out from a very, very small facility into a facility that was 260 people strong and produced over 580 very complicated visual effects shots.
I think the other key reason that Lord of the Rings can be made today is because of the advances in technology, that obviously with the advent of computer visual effects that really have only come about in the last 7 or 8 years, we are now able to show the images that Tolkien described on screen. Making this film back in the 80s, for instance, you know, our resources would have been much more limited. I think the result wouldn't have been as satisfying.
For most of the shots, most of the environmental shots in Lord of the Rings, there was always some kind of digital manipulation. Anything from removing fences and roads, which of course we wouldn't want to keep in Middle-earth, to constructing extensions and entirely new mountain ranges or cloud structures or things that are required to bring it to life.
Sometimes that's why shots turn out to be more difficult than they are, because they become digital effect shots when, when they weren't originally intended to do that. That Elvish Ruin shot was very demanding because the plate was shot from a helicopter. You had the Fellowship walking around the hilltop, but the helicopter actually drifted quite a long way away from the hill during the shot, so the operator, who was in the cab of the helicopter, zoomed in through the shot. And that just made the camera track where the digital camera is created that actually matches what the physical camera was doing on the day much, much more difficult.
There was a fair amount of motion blur and jitter that needed to be taken out.
It was impossible to completely lock the digital camera to the plate.
So any of our computer-generated elements, i.e. the ruins, weren't happily locking on the top of the hill. With all the issues that we were having inside the camera to try and pin the ruins onto the top of the hill, it just seemed to be much of an easier path to replace the whole hill. So that's what we did. That involved actually creating a three-dimensional representation, geometry wireframe that would fit in with the environment and replace the hill that was originally there. And this allowed us to more seamlessly integrate the ruins into the environment as opposed to having them stand out in contrast next to the live hill.
And this is the model that we produced of the Elvish Ruins. It's built very much to look good from the camera's point of view. There's nothing really much over the back of the hill. So it's kind of like a digital equivalent of a film set, where if the camera doesn't see it, you just don't bother building it. We also did what we called CG environments, where we actually build an environment entirely on the computer. Dwarradolf is a great example because that's just an environment that would be very difficult to build on set. It's so vast. I think it's 45 meters from the floor to the ceilings of that space. I think they did consider doing Dwarradolf as a miniature, but they quickly realized that in some of those shots, when you're looking down the long corridors of pillars, you're seeing hundreds and hundreds of pillars in some of those shots, and it would have been prohibitive to build even a miniature environment that covered the scope of that shot.
Actually, I'd spent a lot of time giving some thought to how the environment would be lit. Here's this area of Dwarradolf that stretches forever. These corridors are kilometres and miles long, and it's lit by a torch that Aragorn's carrying and Gandalf's staff.
Pete's note on these views we get down these long avenues of pillars was that we never see a wall at the end. He never wanted to feel like there were any boundaries to the space. So in terms of modelling, we built a pillar element and a ceiling element and a basic floor element. And then just doing what we do in the computer very easily, we replicated these to create the whole environment of Dwarrowdale.
The great realm and dwarf city of Dwarrowdale.
One of the real motivations for me to want to make The Lord of the Rings was the monsters. I mean, it seems like a strange thing to admit, because obviously the film has a lot more going for it than just monsters. But I've always thought it would be great to do, a fantasy film in that Harryhausen style, but with computer-generated creatures. The Watcher ultimately is, he comes from the depths of the world beneath Moria, and he's sort of escaped out into this lake, and that's where he lives. I mean, the book is not really much more than a tentacle that sort of squirms out of the water and then gets chopped off. And I just wanted this creature to be, a little bit more monstery than that.
So the obvious answer would be to do that digitally. The brief from Peter was that he didn't want it to look like the the old rubber tentacle on a wire coming in and grabbing around an actor and pulling him in. He really wanted these dynamics, and he wanted this thing moving a lot quicker and splashing, and the actors are coming out and slashing tentacles off, and this thing's thrashing around the water. And the job was then to go back and stick the Watcher in there, knowing that they were going to be hacking at a tentacle at one point. So the first part is actually getting the Watcher itself moving correctly and making it again feel as though it's this living kind of squid-like, gelatinous kind of creature. So it's not just a solid creature. It's actually, as it's moving, it kind of has this real blubbery sort of skin texture to it. The next component of all this was doing water and splashing water and getting that stuff to come off the tentacles as you raised up. And that was really kind of the key. We had the tentacles moving correctly, but it just didn't have the dynamic. It just kind of seemed like these things were just flying in space. And the minute we started adding this water splash to it, it just turned it from a nothing shot into this real action-packed shot.
The creatures, they were designed to have a rationale to their physiology. The cave troll was designed to look like it's a humanoid creature that could physically exist.
I always think the best monsters have personalities, and I wanted the cave troll to be, I wanted him to be basically a bit stupid. That he's not an evil creature, he's just a sort of like a big, clumsy kid who's fallen in with some bad friends, that the goblins have kind of, they've got him on a chain, and they probably treat him pretty badly, and I always imagined that the cave troll had a mother, and that, she was probably waiting for him somewhere else in Moria. She probably had his bed turned down and a glass of warm milk by his bed, and, he's never going to come home. It's kind of, it's sad.
The cave troll was the first creature that we actually took to completion. It was one of the first things turned over from Richard Taylor, one of the early creatures that was scanned by Matt Aiken, and was, if you like, the test creature for the pipeline from soup to nuts of the creation of a final, finished, workable, usable creature in the film. And so we learned a lot with him.
How do you get the skin to move correctly over this cave troll? As he's putting his arm back, you want to see stretching and muscles and all that sort of thing. So we actually went with a kind of a skeleton muscular system where we literally, you could take the skin off the cave troll, and the next layer underneath would be the muscles. And if you pull the muscles, the next layer would be the skeleton. And so what happens is you do get that nice kind of flexing thing. So as he moves back, he gets a bulge here, and this stretches here correctly. And it's all because those muscles, the skin is basically sliding over the muscles just like your skin would do.
We did an early animation test using a bouncing ball that was, I think, very encouraging for us, and assured New Line that we were on the right path to being able to create creatures that were going to habitate the film and look good.
The troll scene at that point had been a couple of good bits of business and a lot of close-ups. You had the troll smashing Balin's tomb, and you had Merry and Pippin jumping on the back of the troll, and you had the troll getting shot through the mouth into the brain. But that was pretty much it.
We came up with a wonderful concept. It was driven by John Shields at Weta. It was a way of planning the cave troll fight scene so that we could actually see a version of the monster long before it was ever put in there properly by the Weta CG artists. And so what we did is we created a computer version of the set. So we built a very crude version of the set that existed in a computer.
The destruction of your planet will commence in 4 of your Earth days.
I put on the motion capture suit, acted out the troll with sound counts playing on the playback, so I could just hit, certain actions at certain times. So now we have a big troll inside Balin's tomb, all existing in virtual world. Then we went back and we rescaled the motion capture stage so that a human who before represented the troll now represents a human-sized guy. And so we did that for all the main characters, and we'd rescale it for a hobbit size and have a hobbit, in it. Then we had all those, we put them all together, all 9 characters and a troll together in this set, so it would play back as a choreography. And then we went and got the virtual camera.
The motion capture guys who normally, put their reflective tape on humans and on objects and whatnot and capture all that motion and turn it into digital information, decided to do the same thing with a camera.
I was given a piece of wood, kind of like a lump of wood, which was a camera. And the reason it was a camera is because they had attached these electrode things to this lump of wood. It was on a stick, it was a thing on a stick.
So all of a sudden, they had a steady cam inside the computer, and when you put on a pair of VR goggles and saw what the computer could see through that camera, all of a sudden you had a viewfinder.
I was now being able to sort of move a fake kind of camera within a computer world of the set.
And you could just sit there and run around like a documentary cameraman, which is the way we approached it. So we did it real roughshod.
It was all of this was being recorded on videotape. And so what it ultimately allowed me to do was to, in a total virtual CG world, I was able to film the cave troll as if I was on set with a camera. The Balrog was always a really difficult creature to visualize and ultimately a very difficult creature to execute in the movie. We had to design a solid Balrog, and we sort of took our lead from John Howe's designs, and we sculpted a maquette of a creature that looks like a creature with skin, but then we wanted to really not see much of his skin. We wanted to have cracks and like glowing lava beneath the cracks, like he was actually made up of fire or lava.
We were going to have to end up doing it CG, and the reason why I was so afraid of that was there's just something about computer-generated fire. You can get the dynamics working correctly, and you can get the stuff flowing nicely, and it all does the right thing, but it doesn't look correct.
Instead of taking the path of digitally synthesizing fire, instead we opted for shooting live elements of fire, little explosions, gas, jets, propane, bits and pieces. And these elements then we drove around in the image using a particle system. We just spent a lot of time on it, and it's sprites. A sprite is a card, it's a billboard that's attached to the particle. So as your particle flies through space, this picture of evolving fire flies through space. For a particle system, you can apply whatever natural forces that you can devise, wind and gravity and friction and any other dynamic forces. We create particle systems to sculpt simulations of natural phenomena like fire and smoke, and when it would be too complex to animate each individual dot or drop.
It was basically shooting fire, creating this fire, sticking it onto these particles, and then these particles decided how these flames would kind of snake around and move based on where it was going.
The Balrog emoted in many different ways over the course of the sequence. Inside, he's all turmoil, he's all fire, and it's barely contained within this cracked skin, and every time he moves his shoulders, the crack starts separating and the plates float on his surface like tectonic plates. And his particular motions and actions needed to emote through his fire. There's various shots of him being all Charles Atlas and blowing fire from every crack on his body, which was quite fun. It was all a bit of a blur, really. About a month's worth of R&D developing sprites and techniques to make sure that we could actually do every shot. Then after that, about 6 weeks of intense production in a team of 5 people. It was an epic rush, actually, but it was definitely worthwhile. We were churning out shots by the day.
In terms of farming work out, there wasn't a whole lot farmed out. There was the Fort of Brunin. The reason why that was farmed out, it was a nice little sequence piece, which was very complex and took a lot of time to do.
Digital Domain got involved in Lord of the Rings as they were nearing the end of their schedule. they realized that they had a couple more things than they could do on the project, so they started to go out to people who they had some comfort level with. We had worked with one of the producers there before. Our interaction with the folks from Weta was one in which initially we got some very early rough cuts of the way they saw the scene going, using the plates that they were interested in. They had already shot quite a few of the plates, of course, because they had intended to do the work themselves. And then they sent us some early artists' renditions of what the water horses might look like. Once the wraiths cross into the riverbed, the rising, flooding river now turns into these very ephemeral, amorphous horses that are the water horses that end up basically trampling the ring wraiths. In addition to the interactive water of these horses running towards us, the entire sequence is made up of either manufactured or shot elements of water and then sewn into the scene, as you would say. The water horses were using the same models of the horses that we used for the ring race, but then we just brought those into Houdini and used some of our own 3D methodologies for simulating water and cloud-like and volumetric type scenarios. When you mix all these other 3D passes and all that water, you got something. It's a combination of the real elements and the CG elements that is really what makes it work.
Peter wanted to make this Wraith world a kind of a slightly scary place where you don't necessarily want to be, because otherwise you just stick the ring on and walk around invisible the whole time.
Peter's theory originally was he wanted it to be this kind of almost glary, white, really fast-moving, very frenetic, like windy kind of world when Frodo puts the ring on and he goes into this other universe, essentially.
The idea was to make it look like a painful place to be in, and so these bits and pieces of him are just kind of almost tearing off as he walks through this thing.
There's a really fast wind blowing on them, and as the wind blows, it tears them apart, and pieces fly off. And then as the wind disappears, the pieces maybe come back and you like reconstitute. The technique that Weta finally started employing was this thing called O-flow. Optical flow is a method of distorting imagery using other moving footage as a kind of a trigger for the distortion.
It was a combination of kind of 3D, 2D effects where we created particle systems that we'd have to hand track.
For instance, you can get a distortion on a person or on an object that looks like water ripples. And the way you use it, the way you do it is you actually shoot real water ripples in high contrast, and then those ripples then are used as a trigger for how you distort later. And you could use anything. You could use fire, which is what we ended up using for the Wraith World look. Actually shot fire. You're not using the imagery, you're using the pattern of the imagery to create a physical distortion. And it worked beautifully.
A really cool technique that Weta developed is this handheld scanner that they found that had been being used by the meat board in New Zealand to scan carcasses for some grading purposes. It's a vast improvement over the way it used to be done with sectioning, scanning in and sectioning off a maquette. The extensive use of miniatures and big wide shots that we wanted to capture, and some of the hazardous places we would have had to place our actors on either a blue screen stage or on a real location, demanded that we create a digital double for each of our main casts so that we could actually have our actors put in these situations and run across terrain or through the mines of Moria.
The first thing that they had to do is they actually went out and used our 3D laser scanning system to scan the faces of the actors that were going to be used, digital doubles.
So auditioning for the new Matrix movie, that's what it is.
I was trying to imagine this process and
You're going to be like in a starting pose like this. This is how you start all your moves, okay? We'll take a snapshot, we'll identify all the markers, because there's 12 cameras looking at you, and we want them all to know what marker 1 is, what marker 2 is, so and so.
We did motion capture, so their motions were actually the actors themselves doing the motion. Once you have all this stuff in, it is just a matter then of figuring out the camera information for that, sticking them into the scene, lighting them, rendering them in there.
There's certain shots where you're actually doing more with the camera, or the model is so big that you cannot possibly build even a set that big to shoot against blue screen?
The digital doubles were, used coming down those ridiculous steps. They're ridiculous in their pitch. They're like a Mayan pyramid, and the concept of Mayan pyramid is, it's very embarrassing if they throw the corpses of their sacrifices down the stairs, and they stop midway. That just wrecks everybody's afternoon. So they build them so the corpses all get all the way down there. Same thing with actors running down a set built like that, except the actors aren't corpses yet. You don't want them to become corpses, right? We just sort of took the risk away and made them digital doubles.
One of the last shots we did for the fellowship using computer people is the one where the camera soars up over the bridge of Khazad-dûm. That was a miniature that Alex Funke shot of the bridge.
The motion capture on the bridge was quite elaborate. We did that with each character captured separate. Not only that, since the bridge is about 150 feet long, we had to capture it in from 3 to 5 separate sections. We'd capture a guy running across the bridge, and we'd have to blend them together. The motion editors blended it together. We're drawing more and more elaborate paths with every person that got on there. So by the time we had them all across, it was really, the job got tougher and tougher with each guy, because they're running along and then one will slow down a little bit and the other will have to slow down and change his weight and all that. It's really pretty elaborate.
Every time I see the movie, I look closely at those guys and I can't even tell that they're not real. They look totally believable.
Peter actually went back and hired a programmer who he's worked with over the years, Stephen Regulus, who actually wrote this program we call Massive to create this massive army in the prologue.
There's artificial intelligence, which is basically an attempt at emulating the processes of a human mind. But there's also artificial life, which is really more of an inspiration for Massive, which is using natural processes to create lifelike results. In Massive, we try to achieve natural crowd-like behavior, not by controlling a whole crowd, but by creating one agent who will react naturally to his environment. We call them agents because it's a common term in artificial intelligence for a decision-making unit. Then when we put thousands of them together, they will give us an emergent crowd behavior that is also natural, without us having to say how the crowd has to behave.
Most of the late work in Massive was in basically enhancing the brains, enhancing the modularity of the brains, and developing more sophisticated behaviors. Again, always in the hopes that the more sophisticated the behavior, the more compelling and truthful the resultant motion would be.
Film 1, I think you pretty much ask anybody in the facility, and it was just pain. It was just pure pain.
Someone said, hey, I can almost see the light at the end of the tunnel, and someone else saying, no, that's the train. That's how it felt.
The pleasure kind of comes on that last day when you kind of look at it all and you see the film for the first time, and it's like, oh my God, this all works, it all comes together.
The sense of commitment on the picture overall, where the picture ceases to be a really good effects reel and becomes an experience. I think that's the test of a lot of landmark films, and I think this is going to be one of them. You are seeing a lot of elements that have never been really put together at this level before. Or not. Maybe it'll stink. I don't know.
Instead of working on the latest effect, the latest technology to break the boundaries, it was nice to be using the tricks that we've learned in our trade, the things that we know how to do, and use them as artist tools. It was nice to just be delivering Middle Earth. It's been quite a joy just getting into the nuts and bolts of building something so cool. I mean, with material like this, it's hard to go wrong.